All right, so we're diving into Stephen Covey's First Things First. We're going to explore the main ideas in the book and really focus on how we can apply these ideas to our own lives. And I think a lot of you listening are probably hoping to cut through the noise and understand the core principles so you can actually apply them in your lives, right?
Well, yeah, that's the goal, isn't it? And what I find fascinating about this book is that, it doesn't just throw a bunch of abstract theories at you. It actually starts with this feeling that I think a lot of us can relate to, that feeling of constantly being pulled in a million different directions.
Well, absolutely.
It's like work deadlines and family commitments and personal goals, all these things coming at us at once.
Yeah.
And it's like we're just reacting to everything all the time. We're never really in control.
And it's exhausting.
It is, yeah.
And you hit on something that really stood out to me when I was reading the book, and it's that idea of an urgency addiction.
Yeah.
It's like we're getting these little hits of dopamine every time we check something off our to-do list.
Right.
But then we realize that most of those things we're checking off, they're not really moving us closer to what we truly value.
Yeah, and the scary thing is this whole urgency addiction, it can actually become a company culture.
Oh, I can see that.
I mean, Covey gives this great example in the book about this Australian executive who realized that his entire company, like their whole culture, was built around putting out fires.
Oh, wow.
Everyone was rewarded for being busy, but no one was actually stepping back to think strategically about, the long-term goals.
Like they were just constantly in reaction mode.
Exactly.
It's like that old saying, working hard on the wrong things is like climbing the wrong ladder.
Oh, that's a good
You might
way.
climb really efficiently, but you're just going to end up in the wrong place.
Absolutely.
But I think it's important to point out that sometimes urgent things are actually important, right?
Mm.
Like Covey talks about that story where he helped his friend through a personal crisis, even though it disrupted his entire schedule.
Right, and that's an important point. It's not about ignoring urgent matters altogether.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we always have a choice in how we respond.
Okay, that makes sense.
So are we going to, just react to every fire drill that pops up, or are we going to, really make a conscious decision about where we focus our energy?
So how do we get out of this urgency trap? How do we even know where to focus our energy?
Well, that's where I think Covey's time management matrix comes in handy.
Yeah, the famous matrix.
Yeah, he basically divides our activities into these 4 quadrants, right? You've got urgent important, not urgent important, urgent not important, and not urgent not important.
Right. And I remember when I first saw that matrix, it felt a little overwhelming, to be honest.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's like, how do you categorize every single task?
Right.
But then I realized that the real power of that matrix is that it helps us see the importance of that quadrant too, those not urgent important activities.
Exactly. And that's the quadrant that so many people neglect. It's almost like we're addicted to the urgent because it makes us feel productive. But by mastering that quadrant too, that's how you start to actually take control of your life. You're not just letting external forces dictate your every move.
It makes me think of that story Covey tells about that college dean who was amazing at fundraising, but then he totally neglected the needs of the faculty. And what happened? Morale plummeted, and the dean lost the trust of everyone.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example.
And it just shows how we can't just be in this constant state of reaction. I mean, quadrant stuff might feel important in the moment, but if we're not investing in those quadrant 2 activities like building relationships and planning for the future, eventually we're going to pay the price.
Yeah, 100%. It's about playing the long game, not just putting out fires all the time.
So how do we actually shift our focus to those quadrant 2 activities? I know Covey talks about the law of the farm, but I'm not sure I fully grasped that concept.
Well, the law of the farm is a great analogy for understanding how consistent, small efforts in personal development, they lead to huge long-term results.
Hmm.
Just like, how a farmer has to tend to their crops day after day if they want to have a good harvest.
Right, you can't just cram for a harvest.
Exactly, exactly. You have to, nurture the seeds, cultivate the soil, do all the little things consistently.
Okay, that's a good point.
And it's the same with our personal growth,
Oh, I see what you mean.
We can't just expect to make a few big pushes and suddenly achieve all our goals.
Like you can't neglect your health for months and then just expect to suddenly run a marathon.
Exactly.
You have to be consistent with those healthy habits day after day.
And it's not just about achieving goals,
Right.
It's about living a life that's aligned with your values, your purpose. And those small, consistent efforts, those quadrant 2 activities, they are what ultimately leads to the greatest results. It's about playing the long game, right?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, Covey also talks about this idea of a personal integrity account.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you could explain how that ties into living a Quadrant 2 life.
Sure. Think of it like this. Every time you make and keep a commitment to yourself, you're making a deposit into this account.
Okay.
Even a small commitment like making your bed every morning or sticking to your workout routine or even just taking, 15 minutes a day to read something that inspires you.
Yeah, those little things.
And on the flip side, every time you break a commitment to yourself, you're making a withdrawal. And I know for me, I used to feel terrible when I broke even those small promises to myself. And then I realized it was because those little breaches of trust were actually eroding my self-trust, my self-esteem.
Interesting.
And so, even something as simple as making my bed every morning became like this symbolic act of rebuilding my integrity.
Yeah, that's powerful.
And, in the book, Covey shares this amazing story about this man whose life was just completely falling apart. And he started rebuilding his life by making and keeping these tiny commitments to himself. And it's amazing how those small wins just created this ripple effect that transformed his whole life.
That's so inspiring. And it shows how we build trust with ourselves the same way we build trust with others, right?
Exactly.
By being consistent, by being reliable.
And that self-trust, that's really the foundation for everything else.
Yeah, I could see that.
That's what gives us the confidence to set bigger goals, to take risks, to persevere when things get tough.
So how do we actually put all of this into practice? I know Covey gives us this whole system for organizing our lives around these principles,
Hmm.
but I've got to admit, it can be a little overwhelming to know where to even start.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It can be a little daunting.
Yeah.
But, it's important to remember it's a journey, right? It's not like you just suddenly arrive at this perfect state of quadrant two living. It's about, taking it one step at a time. And Covey provides us with a very practical framework that he calls Quadrant two organizing.
Okay, tell me more about that.
It's basically a 6-step process for planning your week in a way that prioritizes those important but not urgent activities.
Okay, so walk me through those steps. I'm ready to get organized, like for real this time.
Okay, all right. So step one is all about connecting with your mission statement. What are your core values? What kind of impact do you want to make on the world? Because having that clear sense of purpose, it's like having a compass, right?
Yeah.
It guides your decisions and actions.
It keeps you headed in the right direction, even when things get tough.
Exactly. Now, I know a lot of people struggle with defining their mission statement.
It can feel like a big abstract concept.
It can, yeah. But it doesn't have to be this, grand, eloquent statement. It can just be a simple list of your core values, the things that matter most to you in life, your guiding principles. Just get those down on paper.
Okay, that makes sense. So once we have that mission statement, kind of like our North Star, what's the next step in this Quadrant 2 organizing process?
So the next step is to review your roles.
Okay.
Think about all the different hats you wear in your life.
Okay.
Like you're a parent, a partner, a friend, an employee, a community member. And each of these roles comes with its own set of responsibilities and opportunities.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. It's like seeing the bigger picture of your life.
Yeah, exactly. And once you've got a good understanding of your roles, then the next step is to choose your goals for the week. And here's the key. Those goals need to be aligned with your mission statement and your roles. They should be those quadrant two activities that move you closer to what truly matters.
So it's not just about creating a random to-do list.
Right, exactly.
It's about strategically choosing goals that are actually going to make a difference in your life.
That's it. It's about being intentional with your time, making sure your actions are aligned with your values and your long-term vision.
Okay, so we've got our mission statement, we've reviewed our roles, we've chosen our goals. Now what?
Now it's time to schedule your week.
Okay.
This is where, you got to actually put pen to paper,
Right.
block out time for those quadrant two goals, just like you would schedule any other important meeting.
Yeah.
Treat those activities with the same respect you would a meeting with your boss or a doctor's appointment.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
It's like making those Quadrant 2 activities non-negotiable.
Exactly. Give them the priority they deserve.
Okay, and what's the next step?
So step 5 is to adapt daily. Life happens.
Right.
So be flexible and adjust your schedule as needed, but always, always come back to those quadrant two priorities.
It's about having that awareness of when you're getting sucked into the urgency vortex and then consciously choosing to come back to what matters most.
Exactly. Yeah. And then finally, step 6 is to evaluate at week's end. So, did you achieve your goals? What went well? What could you do differently next week? It's all about creating that feedback loop so you're constantly learning and improving.
I remember when I first started trying to wrap my head around this whole concept of prioritizing Quadrant 2, Covey's rocks in a jar analogy really helped me get it.
Ah, yes. The rocks in a jar.
It's such a simple analogy, but so powerful.
It is, eh?
Like, imagine you have this jar, right? And you have some big rocks, some smaller pebbles, and some sand.
Yeah.
And those big rocks, they represent your Quadrant 2 priorities, like the most important things in your life.
Right?
Now, if you try to put the pebbles and sand in the jar first, there's no room for those big rocks.
Right.
But if you put those big rocks in first, the smaller stuff, it'll just naturally fill in the gaps.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's a great way to visualize the importance of planning and intentionality. If we don't make time for those big rocks, those Quadrant 2 activities, they're just never going to fit into our lives. We'll be so busy reacting to the urgent that we'll never get to what truly matters.
Yeah, and I remember another story from the book that really helped me understand the importance of like clear communication and expectations. It was that story about the consultant hiring his friend to landscape his yard.
Oh, yeah, right.
He assumed his friend knew what he wanted,
Oh, yeah?
but he didn't communicate clearly, so the results were disastrous. They both ended up frustrated and disappointed.
And it just shows how even when we're trying to delegate Quadrant 2 activities, we still need to invest the time up front to ensure clear communication and shared understanding.
Because effective delegation isn't about just dumping tasks on other people.
Right.
It's about empowering them to contribute their talents and skills in a way that aligns with the overall vision.
And speaking of vision, Covey talks about how crucial it is to have a compelling vision for your life, one that's rooted in your principles and values.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's that vision that fuels our actions, right?
Yeah.
And helps us stay focused on the long term. It's
Yeah.
like having that picture in your mind of where you want to go.
Right, and it helps you stay motivated, especially when things get tough.
Exactly. But Covey also contrasts this vision with the social mirror vision.
Oh, the social mirror. Yeah, tell me more about that.
So the social mirror is that tendency we have to base our vision on what other people expect of us
Oh, okay.
or on what society tells us we should be doing.
Yeah, instead of looking inward to discover what truly resonates with our authentic selves.
Exactly. And he argues that this can actually lead to a lot of disconnection and dissatisfaction,
Yeah.
even if we achieve what looks like external success.
Because we're living someone else's script instead of writing our own.
Yeah, exactly. We might achieve what society considers success, but it won't feel fulfilling because it's not aligned with our values and aspirations.
I see. And I remember Covey uses some really powerful stories to illustrate this point.
Oh, absolutely. Like that research showing that children who have a clear sense of who they want to be, what they want to contribute, those children tend to do better in school and life.
Right. And then there's that story of the man who achieved what most people would consider great success, but then realized it just wasn't aligned with his mission.
Mm.
And he made this courageous decision to actually realign his actions with his values.
See, and you know what? He found true liberation in doing so.
Wow, that's a great story. So it's never too late to change course, to reevaluate our choices, and make sure they're leading us towards a life that feels meaningful and fulfilling.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's about having the courage to define success on our own terms, not based on what society tells us.
Absolutely, yeah. It's about living authentically. But, it's not just about personal success, right? It's about how our choices impact those around us.
Right. So how do we make sure that the choices we're making, those Quadrant 2 choices, how do we make sure they're not only benefiting us personally, but also empowering those around us?
That's a great question. And it leads us to another one of Covey's core principles, the power of empowerment. And that means empowering ourselves, but also empowering others.
So how does Quadrant 2 of thinking play into that? How does it help us empower ourselves and others?
Well, I think when we focus on those Quadrant 2 activities, we're building trust and we're building a shared vision.
Okay.
And those are really the foundations for empowering relationships. Think about it. If you're constantly reacting to the urgent, you're just putting out fires all the time, you're not creating the space for meaningful connection and collaboration.
Oh, that's a good point. You're so busy reacting that you don't have time to build those relationships.
Right, exactly. But when you're being proactive, when you're planning and prioritizing, you create the space for other people to contribute their talents and their ideas.
So it's about shifting from a mindset of control to a mindset of empowerment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Covey, he gives us some very practical steps for empowering others, like setting clear expectations and agreements, focusing on win-win solutions, really seeking to understand different perspectives.
Yeah, so it's about creating that culture of collaboration, that culture of shared ownership, where everyone feels valued and respected.
Exactly. And, in the book, he tells this great story about this team whose performance dramatically improved after they developed a shared vision. They went from being a group of individuals to being this cohesive unit working towards a common goal.
That's so powerful. And it reminds me of that other story about the manager who felt so empowered by his leader who really trusted him and mentored him.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It wasn't about micromanaging. It was about creating an environment where that manager felt supported and challenged to grow.
Yeah. And then there's that powerful story about facilitating dialogue between people who had completely opposing viewpoints on a really sensitive issue.
Wow.
It shows how empathy can actually create space for collaboration and problem solving.
It's amazing how these simple shifts in mindset can lead to such profound changes.
It really is. Yeah.
And all of this really ties into Covey's idea of the interdependence of life.
Oh, absolutely. He reminds us that our quality of life is inherently interconnected with the quality of life of those around us. Our roles, our accomplishments, even our sense of well-being, it's all intertwined.
It's like this beautiful tapestry of human connection where our individual threads are all contributing to something much larger and more meaningful.
I love that image. And, he uses some interesting examples to illustrate this point, like, talking about the challenges of these total quality initiatives and these empowerment programs, and emphasizing that personal integrity is really the foundation for success.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
You can't build a truly empowering organization if people are operating from a place of self-interest or dishonesty. It just doesn't work.
And I remember that powerful story he tells about the man who challenged him to look inward and examine his own relationships before trying to change the world.
Oh, yes, that's a powerful one.
It's such a great reminder that real change starts with ourselves.
Right.
You can't effectively empower others if you haven't done the work to empower yourself.
It all comes back to that principle of integrity, right? Aligning our actions with our values, acting with authenticity and compassion.
Yeah, it's about being the change you want to see in the world. And,
Ah.
all of this, it's not just about personal effectiveness. It's about contributing to a better world for everyone.
Yeah.
But it's also about cultivating inner peace, right?
Absolutely. When we put first things first, when we're living in alignment with our principles and our conscience, we experience a deep sense of inner peace.
Ooh,
It's that feeling of harmony between our actions and our values.
yeah.
And I think Covey shares that really impactful story of the psychologist who finally found peace after years of living a lie and then choosing to finally live with integrity.
Yeah, that was a powerful story.
It just shows that true peace isn't about our external circumstances.
It's about the state of our inner world.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's about living in harmony with our conscience.
You've shared so many amazing insights from this book. First Things First really is a guide for living a more fulfilling, meaningful, and impactful life. But for someone who's just starting to explore these ideas, what would you say is the most important thing to remember?
That's a great question. I think if I had to distill it down to one key message, it would be this. Putting first things first means making conscious choices that are aligned with your deepest values and your long-term goals. It's about shifting your focus from urgency to importance. It's about moving from that state of constant reaction to a state of conscious creation.
It's about becoming the author of your own life, not just a passive bystander. And we've got to remember, this isn't the destination, it's a journey.
Absolutely.
And there will be setbacks, there will be challenges, but the important thing is to just keep coming back to those core principles, to keep striving for that alignment between our actions and our values.
Covey's book gives us a powerful framework for navigating the complexities of life, making choices that lead to more fulfillment and meaning and peace.
And it reminds us that we have the power to create the lives we want
Absolutely.
and to make a positive impact on the world. It's not always easy,
Yeah.
but it's incredibly rewarding. Before we move on to part two, let's give our listeners something to think about. Covey talks about those turning points in life, those moments of decision where choosing to put first things first can completely change our trajectory.
Right.
So what turning point are you at right now?
Yeah, think about that.
What difficult decision are you facing?
And how can these principles help you navigate that decision with courage and integrity and commitment?
We'll be exploring those turning points in more depth when we come back for part two of our deep dive. Until then, keep prioritizing what truly matters.
Absolutely. So welcome back to our deep dive into First Things First. We left off in part one talking about those turning points in life, and I think a lot of times navigating those turning points requires, a certain amount of letting go.
Letting go, yeah, that's an interesting concept. What comes to mind for me is like letting go of old habits, maybe letting go of those limiting beliefs, maybe even like letting go of the need for control.
Yeah, you're hitting on some key points there. You know, Covey really emphasizes that letting go isn't about being weak or giving up.
Okay.
It's actually about releasing that need to have all the answers, and it's about recognizing that sometimes the most effective path forward is one of surrender
Surrender.
and trust. Yeah.
Okay, I can see that. So it's about shifting from that like scarcity mindset where we're always clinging to control
hmm
to a more abundant mindset where we trust that things will work out.
Exactly. He uses this powerful image in the book, falling backward off a cliff. Now, that might sound a little terrifying,
Oh, but yeah.
but it really represents that leap of faith,
Okay.
like embracing the unknown and trusting in those guiding principles, even when we don't know what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah. I've always been someone who likes to have a plan. I like to feel in control. But I'm realizing that sometimes the most amazing things happen when we just surrender to the flow of life and allow ourselves to be guided by something bigger than, our own limited perspective.
That's a beautiful insight. And Covey argues that this principle of letting go, it's especially crucial in leadership.
Oh, that's interesting.
The most effective leaders, they're not the ones who micromanage every little detail.
Yeah.
They're the ones who create that culture of trust and collaboration. They empower people to step up and contribute their unique talents.
I'm thinking of that story in the book about the manager who completely misinterpreted his new boss's approach.
Oh, yeah, right.
The boss offered to help, but the manager, because he was so used to that more controlling leadership style, he just assumed that the boss was trying to take over.
Yeah, but it turned out the boss was genuinely committed to empowering his team.
Yeah.
He provided guidance and support, but he never dictated how things should be done.
He never micromanage.
And the results were incredible.
Yeah, they
The
were.
manager felt this sense of ownership and responsibility that he never felt before.
Absolutely.
It's like when someone truly believes in you, and it just unlocks this level of motivation and potential that you didn't even know you had.
Exactly. Yeah. It's powerful stuff.
hmm
But, I'm curious, have you ever found it difficult to actually embrace this empowering leadership style,
hmm
especially when you're working within like a system that's designed for control and competition? I mean, I think a lot of us face that challenge.
Oh, absolutely. It can be so challenging, especially when you're surrounded by people who are still operating from that old paradigm of, I'm the boss, you do what I say.
Mhm.
It makes you wonder if empowerment is even possible. And Covey addresses this head on. He acknowledges those real-world challenges, and he emphasizes the importance of having clear agreements with the people we lead, agreements that outline the results we want to achieve, the guidelines, the resources, how we're going to measure success, and what the consequences are if things don't go as planned.
So it's like creating this framework for empowerment where everyone knows what's expected of them.
Yeah.
They understand the shared goals, even within a system that maybe doesn't naturally support this approach.
Exactly. And he also stresses the importance of communication and feedback.
Right, because it's not just about setting those agreements and then forgetting about them.
Exactly. It's about regular check-ins, it's about open dialogue, it's about being willing to adapt as needed.
And, he gives some great advice for how to give and receive feedback effectively.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Focusing on the agreement rather than personalities or judgments, encouraging self-evaluation,
Yeah.
really helping people assess their own performance and figure out how they can grow.
Yeah, it's about creating that culture of learning and continuous improvement where feedback is seen as a gift, not a threat.
That makes sense. But what about those situations where someone is just resistant to being empowered? Or what if the system itself is set up for a win-lose dynamic, like, where collaboration is actually discouraged? Have you ever encountered that?
Oh, many times. Covey acknowledges those tricky situations. He recognizes that there will be times when people resist being empowered.
Right.
And sometimes it's the individual, sometimes it's the system itself that's holding people back. But he encourages us to be patient
Okay.
and to stay true to our principles and to trust that our example, even if it's just a small example, it can have a ripple effect.
Okay, so even if it feels like we're not making much progress, our actions can still have an impact.
Absolutely. It's like planting a seed.
Yeah.
It might take a while for it to sprout and grow, but with consistent nurturing, it will eventually break through. It's about playing the long game, you know?
And being patient with the process.
Exactly, yeah. And one thing he suggests is actually involving the people we lead in the process of creating the mission statement and agreements. Because when people feel a sense of ownership, they're more likely to buy into those principles of empowerment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's about co-creating that vision, not just imposing it from the top down.
Exactly, yeah. And sometimes the best approach is to simply ask empowering questions instead of giving directives.
Okay. What kind of questions are we talking about?
Things like, what do you recommend? Or what would you like to see happen? You know, these questions, they spark creativity, they encourage initiative, and they cultivate that sense of responsibility.
Yeah, it shifts that dynamic, right? It's
Right.
not, I'm the expert, you do what I say.
Right.
It's more like, we're in this together, let's figure this out.
Exactly. And ultimately, Covey reminds us that real empowerment, it comes from within. It's
Yeah.
about connecting with our own internal compass, that voice of conscience that guides us toward what's right. What's good, it's about having that inner strength and integrity that allows us to act with courage, even when it's hard, and to inspire others to do the same.
Wow, that's powerful. And it really gets to the heart of what First Things First is all about.
Absolutely. It's not about wielding power or control.
Right.
It's about empowering others, creating a world where everyone can thrive.
And it's about building those relationships, those strong, healthy relationships that are based on trust, respect, and mutual empowerment.
Absolutely, yeah. And, those relationships are the foundation for a truly fulfilling life.
I love how Covey weaves together those practical strategies with this deeper philosophical understanding of what it actually means to live a good life.
Mm.
It's not just about achieving external success. It's about becoming the best versions of ourselves,
Yeah.
contributing to something larger than ourselves.
And recognizing that our lives are all interconnected. Our choices impact others. We've talked a lot about the theory behind all of this, but I'm curious to hear some practical examples of how you've seen these principles play out in real life.
Oh, yeah, me too. Maybe from your own work or just stories you've encountered.
Yep.
Because it's always inspiring to see how these ideas translate into real change.
I'm glad you asked, because the real magic of first things first is in the application. I've seen these principles transform teams, families, and organizations. One story that comes to mind is about this company that was struggling with a toxic work environment.
Okay.
Everybody was operating from this place of fear and scarcity, and it was affecting everything: their productivity, their morale, even their personal lives.
Sounds like a classic case of urgency addiction.
Exactly. So busy putting out fires that they couldn't even address the underlying issues. Then this new CEO came in, and he was deeply committed to Covey's principles. And he started by creating this shared vision for the company, one rooted in trust and collaboration and mutual respect.
So he brought everyone together and he facilitated this open dialogue,
Yeah.
helped them identify their shared goals and aspirations.
Exactly. He helped them move from a place of fear to a place of shared purpose. And he also implemented the Quadrant II organizing process.
So, making sure they were taking the time to build relationships, develop skills, create a more empowering work environment.
Right? All those things that nourish the soul of a company, not just chasing short-term profits.
Now, I'm guessing there was some resistance at first, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. People were so used to operating in that culture of urgency and control. Change is hard.
Yeah, it always is,
Yeah.
especially when it requires letting go of those old patterns.
Exactly. But this CEO, he had that patience, he had that persistence to really stay true to his vision. And it's really inspiring to see leaders who have the courage to challenge the status quo and create something better.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that even in the toughest situations, we have the power to make a difference.
Absolutely. But that change, it starts with us, our own commitment to putting first things first, aligning our actions with our values, choosing to live a life of integrity and purpose. And those choices, Covey reminds us, they not only transform our own lives, they also impact the lives of everyone around us.
It's that ripple effect again.
Yeah. It makes me think about, how I can be more intentional with my choices to make sure they're actually aligned with the kind of impact I want to have on the world.
And it brings us to this crucial aspect of first things first, cultivating inner peace. We've discussed the power of choice, aligning our actions with our values, but how do we ensure that those principles actually become a lived reality, in the midst of all the chaos of everyday life?
That's the question, isn't it? It's one thing to understand these concepts intellectually, but it's another thing to actually bridge that gap between knowing and doing.
Yeah. It can feel overwhelming to even know where to begin.
You're right. It's a common struggle, and it's something we're going to delve into much deeper in the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore some very specific practices and strategies that can help you cultivate that inner peace and really make those principles a tangible part of your everyday life.
I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah.
So exciting to think about how we can take these ideas and turn them into action, turn them into real change in the world.
Yeah, I'm excited too.
So as we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive, let's leave our listeners with something to ponder. We've talked about aligning our actions with our values, but what does that actually look like for you in your day-to-day life? Where are you experiencing harmony between your actions and your conscience? And where do you feel that sense of dissonance, that misalignment?
It's a great question to reflect on.
And it's something we'll continue exploring as we delve into those practices and principles that help us cultivate inner peace and really, truly live a life that's in alignment with what matters most.
See you in part 3.
So welcome back to our deep dive into First Things First. At the end of part 2, we were talking about trying to align our actions with our values in everyday life. But how do we actually cultivate inner peace in the middle of all the chaos and demands?
It's a struggle, right? We all want peace, but the world just keeps throwing stuff at us. Covey reminds us that real peace, it's not something we find out there in the world. It's something we build on the inside.
It's like creating that inner sanctuary, that place of calm, even when everything around us feels crazy. But how do we do that? What are the building blocks of that inner sanctuary?
One of the most powerful tools, I think, is the practice of what Covey calls sharpening the saw.
Oh, right, yeah.
And that's a key concept from his Quadrant II framework, right? Remember, that's about taking the time to renew ourselves physically, mentally, spiritually, and socially.
Yeah, it's like that reminder to invest in ourselves so we can show up as our best selves in all areas of life. And it's so easy to forget that when we're just caught up in the day-to-day grind.
It's easy to let those things slide, yeah.
But Covey's saying that if we neglect our well-being, we're actually less effective in the long run.
We think we're saving time by skipping those things, but we're actually just making things harder on ourselves in the end.
Right.
He uses this great analogy. Imagine you're trying to cut down a tree with a dull saw. You're going to expend way more energy, take way longer, and the results are going to be messy. But if you just take a little bit of time to sharpen that saw, the whole task becomes so much easier.
That's a perfect analogy. It shows that self-care isn't selfish. It's actually an investment in our ability to do everything else better.
Exactly.
So how do we sharpen the saw in all those areas of life? Physical, mental, spiritual, and social. Where do we even begin?
Well, let's start with the physical, okay?
Okay.
That means taking care of our bodies, through exercise, good nutrition, and enough rest. Are we getting enough sleep? Are we moving our bodies regularly? Are we eating healthy foods?
I know I should be doing all of those things, but they're often the first to go when I get stressed.
Wow.
I'll skip my workout, grab something quick to eat because it's easy, and then later, I always regret it.
It catches up with us, yeah.
Yeah.
And, that's the trap we fall into. We think we're saving time, but actually we're just depleting our energy.
Right.
When we prioritize those things, we're actually boosting our energy, our focus, our well-being, everything.
It gives us the fuel we need to thrive. What about the mental dimension? How do we keep our minds sharp?
So for that, it's about engaging our curiosity, stimulating our minds. Things like reading, learning new skills, just exposing ourselves to different viewpoints, having those thought-provoking conversations. These are all great ways to keep our minds sharp.
Covey was such a big advocate for lifelong learning, wasn't he? It's not about formal education. It's about cultivating that love of learning.
Absolutely. He was all about reading widely, challenging your assumptions, and most importantly, he said, finding ways to apply what we learn in our daily lives.
Yeah, that's what makes learning stick, when we can actually use it to make a difference.
Right. Now, what about the spiritual dimension? I know that can feel kind of vague for some people.
Yeah, it's definitely more personal, I think.
It is. For Cover, spiritual renewal is about connecting with those things that give us a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose beyond our daily routines.
It's about nurturing that connection to something bigger than ourselves, whether that's through nature or music, art, faith. For me, I find that spending time in nature is just incredibly rejuvenating. It helps me get back in touch with my sense of awe and wonder.
I love that. And Covey, he encouraged us to find whatever those practices are that nourish our spirit, whether it's meditation or spending time in nature or reflecting on what we're grateful for.
Right. And then there's the social and emotional dimension. How do we sharpen the saw in this area?
For me, this one's about nurturing our relationships. It's about investing in those connections that bring us joy and support. And it's about practicing empathy, really listening to others, trying to see the world from their perspective, building those bridges of understanding.
Yeah. Covey talked a lot about empathy being the foundation of any strong relationship.
Right. And he also emphasized the importance of service, finding ways to contribute to something larger than ourselves.
And those acts of service, they can be big or small, but they are incredibly fulfilling. And they help us get out of our own little bubbles and connect with the world around us.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got these four dimensions of renewal: physical, mental, spiritual, and social. I know it can seem like a lot, but remember,
It's not about being perfect at it all, right?
right, it's just about making those small efforts, being consistent, and finding what works for you.
And as we invest in our well-being, we're actually becoming more capable of contributing to the well-being of others.
It's like that ripple effect we were talking about
It's
earlier.
amazing how it all ties together.
It is, yeah. So as we wrap up this deep dive into first things first, let's leave our listeners with one final thought. We've spent a lot of time talking about the power of making choices that align with our values and all the different practices that can help us create that inner peace. But how do we actually bridge the gap between knowing and doing?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is. So what's one small step you can take today to start putting first things first and move closer to the life you really want?
Remember, even the longest journey starts with that first step. Choose courage over comfort, choose purpose over pressure, and keep putting first things first.
That's it.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into first things first. We hope you found it valuable, and until next time, keep prioritizing what truly matters.